10 May 1945, Mindanao. General Douglas MacArthur's commitment to liberating the Philippines remains constant as he orders elements of the Eighth Army to land at Makahalar Bay on the island's northern coast. Once ashore, they are to advance south to reinforce the embattled 31st Division along the Sahara Highway. The pre-invasion bombardment provides the only fireworks as the soldiers make the landing against no resistance. Contact is made with Filipino guerrillas and patrols set out to scout the perimeter. On the surface, this assault seems merely administrative, but it is actually the checkmate move in a brutal chess game that has allowed American forces to move rapidly across southern Mindanao. April landings at Moro Gulf on the western coast took the Japanese forces by surprise. Their commander, General Yosaku Morozumi, had always expected a landing at Makahalar and deployed his troops accordingly. Unimpeded at Moro, American infantry of the 31st and 24th Divisions advanced eastward to their main objective at Davao Gulf. The city of Davao fell to the Americans on 3 May. And Morozumi tried to shore up his defenses along the southern portion of the Sahara Highway, the main north-south axis in the region. Engaged by the Americans there and continually harassed by guerrilla units everywhere, the enemy commander was forced to leave the Makahalar Bay area undefended. Adhering to Japan's policy of fighting to delay an Allied attack on the home islands, Morozumi's tactics are entirely defensive. The addition of more Eighth Army troops to the Sahara line promises to spoil even this desperate hope. Running short of men, his supplies dwindling if not altogether gone, Morozumi will have little choice but to withdraw his exhausted troops into the western mountains near Malai Balai. There, as everywhere in the Pacific, the wind-scattered straws of the once proud Japanese army will attempt to survive the twilight of their empire and to await the fall of night. Germany has meant a reclamation of national identity. After years beneath the enemy's boot, the French have found redemption in their small contribution. officers charged with the denazification of the government may well wonder if the 1,000-year Reich could yet become a reality. The chaos has left senior commanders little time to share in the celebrations of common soldiers. Spared the responsibility of casualty lists and battle objectives, Allied generals must now chuck their war maps and pick up organizational charts. Prisoners must be processed, jurisdictions maintained, protocols observed. And while dog faces mix with ease among the boisterous ranks of Soviet troops, there is no disguising the chill in the air at the higher latitudes of power. The political winds of post-war Europe are shifting by the second. Although the war is over, the peace could fall to pieces unless East and West come to terms. Up to now, the Allied powers have directed their resources to a single end in the European theater, crushing Nazi Germany. Now that Hitler has left the stage, who will play the villain? And farther from imperial suicide jockeys. Allied success is contingent on a breakthrough by either the 96th or the 6th Marines to their west. A breakthrough by either side will lay open the Yaha-Shuri Road, which lies less than a mile behind the Shuri line. Once captured, this road will afford the Americans a golden opportunity to surround General Mitsuru and his troops. Against Conical Hill, the 96th makes liberal use of its familiar answer to the dug-in Japanese defense: mortars, flamethrowers, and satchel charges. As star-spangled artillery blazes in the background, the GIs probe for a soft spot in the enemy's defenses. Adding to the misery is the onset of Okinawa's monsoon season, which turns the landscape into a quagmire that slows the Americans even further. The GIs reach the crest of the hill after 3 days of intense fighting. Only anti-tank emplacements are anything but sweet. Like Conical Hill on the east, Sugarloaf stands positions and serving as bodyguard to the infantry. Though occasionally felled by hostile fire, the tanks tip the scales in favor of the Americans, and the surviving Japanese are forced to withdraw into an even smaller perimeter, their ranks now all but devoid of experienced fighters. With more than 2,000 casualties of their own, the Westerners too take a deep breath. They gather their replacements, tend to their wounded, and prepare for their next move. With any luck, one more push will squeeze Hirohito right off Okinawa. the blind credulity of his followers, occupied territories. Death knocked upon the doors of Europe's Jews. They were pulled from the lives they knew and packed into ghettos with strangers, if not simply shot dead. The Einsatzgruppen, Hitler's predatory death squads, followed the German army across the continent like vultures, rounding up anyone excluded from the Aryan master plan. The Jews never had a fighting chance. The first rumblings came from the Wannsee Conference at SS headquarters in Germany. Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and other Nazi functionaries laid down in explicit terms the final solution for European Jewry. The victims were to be shipped to the east and exterminated. After several grisly rounds of trial and error, Heinrich Himmler's eager camp commandants honed their murderous technique. Nothing went to waste. Bullets were spared in lieu of gas. Gold was harvested from the mouths of the dead. Hair was transformed into textiles. Yet, despite the efficiency of the Nazi technocrats, the camps were much more than impersonal killing machines. Ethnic Germans were culled from Eastern Europe's hotbeds of anti-Semitism for duty as camp guards. They attacked their job with a fervor born of bred-in-the-bone bigotry, abusing their charges with sadistic glee. Worse still was the more purposeful torture by camp doctors, such as the notorious Josef Mengele of Auschwitz. The availability of human test subjects led to deadly experimentation, all in the name of fraudulent science. Among the inmates, small acts of courage were commonplace, but survival was the order of the day. Tiny morsels of food were like gold and were hoarded as such. From mass graves and carry them in procession to a proper burial ground. The camps will be cleared of the blood and bone dust, but there will never be enough dirt to bury this dark chapter in the history of human endeavor. 23 May 1945, Okinawa. Torrential rains reduced the island's Highway 13 to a latter-day tar pit. Boiling Yankee armor attempting to cut off the southward retreat of the Japanese. American infantry units advanced carefully across the Shuri line, finally broken after weeks of relentless pounding by thousands of Marines and GIs. Allied commanders had hoped to intercept the retreating Imperial forces in a pincers movement along a road spanning southern Okinawa, behind the Japanese command post at Shuri Castle. Unfortunately, the weather has dealt enemy commander General Mitsuru Ushijima a handful of aces. Uncle Sam's tanks and jeeps sink to their fenders in the muck. Cases of supplies and ammo are lugged to the front lines on foot. Without their steel escorts for protection, the 7th Division pushes warily down Highway 13 as far as Yonabaru, but must then wait for its supply line to catch up. A similar scenario is played out on the west side, where the 6th Marine Division sweeps through lightly defended Naha, but cannot execute the left turn toward Shuri. However, General Simon Buckner still believes that his ground forces can catch Ushijima. On 26 May, the retreating enemy column is on the move well south of Shuri, headed for their last remaining defensive perimeter in the Kiyamu Peninsula, just north of the sea and inevitable oblivion. Now Buckner draws a trump card as rainy skies clear just long enough for aerial reconnaissance to spot their quarry. Exposed and vulnerable on the roadways, nearly a third of the remaining enemy, 15,000 soldiers, fall victim to U.S. shells. The action makes for a spectacular send-off for the Naval Command offshore. Vice Admiral Kelly Turner, commander of the combined Okinawa forces, and Task Force 58 mentor Admiral Raymond Spruance get a well-earned ticket back to headquarters before moving on to the planning of the Allied invasion of Hirohito's backyard. In their place, Vice Admiral Harry Hill is told to cash the check that Turner has written. Admiral William Bull Halsey takes the reins of the invasion fleet, renamed Task Force 38. Halsey never went down in anyone's book as a shrinking violet, and upon assuming command, he immediately turns his attention to the continuing nuisance of kamikaze attacks. He dispatches a task group to Kyushu, the makeshift home of the Emperor's Suicide Corps, and pummels the airfield as if to drive the rising sun back into the horizon. Halsey has less luck with Mother Nature. A typhoon, a familiar nemesis to the Admiral, strikes the fleet on 5 June. Tossed like toys in a bathtub, Halsey's boats narrowly avert disaster when his plan to sail around the storm goes awry. One ship is incapacitated, the cruiser USS Pittsburgh, whose bow is torn away in the confusion. Its recovery prompts a moment of levity from a Navy fleet tug. Have sighted the suburb of the Pittsburgh and taken it in tow. Meanwhile, the anxiously awaited end to the impromptu monsoon on Okinawa comes on 28 May. 4 days later, Allied ground units are again ready to push south. First to reach Shuri Castle on 29 May is the 1st Marine Division. Poised for a full-scale assault on the Imperial Army headquarters, the Leathernecks are amazed and relieved to discover the castle all but abandoned. It is an easy victory in a setting where easy victories have been few and far between. The event is a mixed blessing for Buckner. Though elated at the ease with which the castle has fallen, he knows that in this grand-scale game of tag, his troops are still it. They must pursue their adversary onto Okinawa's southern tip, hopefully before Ushijima can set up a new defensive line. Meanwhile, the Marine 6th Division turns its attention to the airfield adjacent to Naha, where a residual force of enemy troops remains entrenched. The Naha airfield and harbor are defended by a 4,000-man naval unit that has ignored the withdrawal order and elected to stand its ground. Making good use of their remaining artillery and large numbers of scavenged machine guns, the disgruntled defenders present a surprisingly daunting barrier to the Marines, who expected a group of only 1,000. Marine General Roy Geiger decides to bypass the minefields and gun batteries blocking the land route to the airport, and orders an amphibious landing to the rear of the Japanese. On 4 June, the 72 Amtraks still available to the Americans land on the tiny peninsula containing the Naha airport. The element of surprise gives Geiger's force an opportunity to claim 1,500 yards of territory and a large piece of the bombed-out airfield. The rest of the facility is taken in 9 days of tedious fighting, involving the now familiar U.S. arsenal of flamethrowers and satchel charges, visiting their own particular brand of fire and brimstone on enemy cave positions as they are found. All but 200 defenders become victims in the melee, with the Americans taking 1,600 casualties. The victory gives the Allies control of Okinawa's last remaining airfield and secures Buckner's rear. The rain and mud have prevented the Americans from intercepting Ushijima. To the Yankee commander's dismay, the final Japanese defensive perimeter emerges on a line of ridges only 2 miles from the ocean. One more star-spangled push is going to be necessary to finish the job on Okinawa. Want all those or tell anyone else where it was. For the other, perhaps less fortunate German commanders who are now prisoners of war, the dock awaits. Area of Luzon. Guerrillas have also made a shambles of Yamashita's supply lines, further tightening the noose around the enemy's necks. Nothing in these forbidding mountains comes easily to the Americans. Yamashita has proven to be one of Japan's shrewdest, least compromising generals in his fanatical willingness to fight to the death. The Imperial Army has consistently held the advantage in terrain and observation. The inland approaches to Shobu's territory are guarded on three sides by mountain ranges. The only accessible beachhead is near Appari in the north. Americans push ahead agonizingly up twisting mountain passes and trails that disappear into dense vegetation. The undergrowth is sown with enemy machine gunners who spring up from invisible pillboxes like targets in a shooting gallery. Mortar fire and hand grenades harry GIs as they press inexorably forward, snaking along hairpin curves and scrambling for cover. GIs suffering from combat fatigue, sleeplessness, and the rigors of a harsh environment hurl themselves forward in frontal attacks against one obstacle after another. Relief is hard to come by. Operations in the southern islands of the Philippines have depleted 6th Army resources, leaving General Kruger with a minimal complement of 4 divisions to deploy across his northwestern front on Luzon. Thankfully, American troops have the worst of the struggle behind them, passing through the twin ordeals of the Villaverde Trail and Balete Pass on their way to Bambang. Now they enter the gentle valley of the Cagayan River to claim the abandoned airfields and pursue the Shobu group westward as they desperately retreat to a last stand area southeast of Bantock. Like most last stands, Yamashita's is doomed to end badly, lacking even the mad dash of the Bushido spirit. Gone are the banzai charge and the reckless defiance of former days. Stalked by hunger and disease, Japanese warriors face the unheroic submission of their bodies to decay rather than the purifying fire of total war. Resistance. The customary pre-invasion bombardment by a combined American-Australian flotilla and American B-24 and B-25 bombers gives the Emperor's garrison reason enough to withdraw and concentrate their efforts elsewhere. Major General George Wotton's troops, who earned the nickname Rats of Tobruk in a valiant defense of that North African outpost early in the war, quickly set up shop near Brunei Bay in preparation for a push inland. As the Aussies push up the coast, the Japanese put up only token resistance. The depleted Imperial contingent numbers only about 800 and is unlikely to prevent the Outback's finest from achieving its objective. However, as in numerous other hotspots in the Pacific Theater, these nearly forgotten sons of the rising sun have enough fight left in them to at least complicate matters. The defenses here resemble the obstacles American forces have faced throughout the Philippines. A littering of booby traps, landmines, and tunnel fortifications make the Aussie advance tedious. When the Japanese do strike, they take advantage of the dense jungle cover, shooting from ambush positions among the heavy growth of rubber and palm trees. The kangaroo soldiers respond with deadly force, clearing positions with artillery fire and close-quarters patrol actions. Their way is often opened by air support. The South China Sea is nearly devoid of Imperial Navy vessels, and northeastern Borneo is well out of kamikaze range. The Japanese airfield at Tarakan was the first parcel of Borneo reclaimed by the Allies in an advance action on 6 May. And the embattled samurai miss it terribly. American P-38s and Royal Australian Air Force Kitty Hawks strafe advanced targets with impunity. Within days, Wotton's rats become river rats, making substantial progress by traveling the interior on barges and boats, bypassing land obstacles and avoiding many natural hazards. There are actually 2 enemies on Borneo: the undermanned and unsupplied human foe, and the well-fortified resistance of the island's diseases and hostile wildlife. Although the Aussies are well accustomed to the excesses of dingoes, crocodiles, and poisonous snakes, the giant apes, winged lizards, and the occasional jungle cat present in this exotic wilderness are another story altogether. Apart from the occasional firefight, however, movement is steady in both directions along the coast. By 29 June, Beaufort and Miri are both in Allied hands, and Papar follows 2 weeks later. Village by village, the Aussies go waltzing Matilda through the countryside, to the enthusiastic welcome of the locals who have endured much grief at Japanese hands. Most of the enemy goes down fighting, except for those few soldiers whose devotion to the Bushido Code fails them. They surrender or flee inland through the jungle, perhaps becoming prey for pythons or rhinos. The Anglos race to reach the oil wells before the Japanese can sabotage them. To its relief, the AIF wins frequently. Its failures, however, are marked by the columns of black smoke that rise above the trees. The smell of burning crude oil pervades the battlefield. It is a noxious stench the troops will remember for a lifetime. On 1st July, the checkmate move begins. Landing craft bearing the Australian 7th Division bear down on the Borneo coast at Balikpapan on the southeastern side. The going here is rougher than at Brunei Bay. 2 weeks of mine-sweeping have opened only a narrow corridor, and the shallow draft leading to the beach prevents the bombardment fleet of Dutch and American ships from closing to a comfortable distance. The enemy is here in greater numbers as well, over 5,000 strong, firing from pillboxes and hillside tunnels a few hundred yards from the beach. For this, the warriors of Oz take a page from the Americans' battle book, engaging their nemesis with Matilda tanks equipped with flamethrowers and eliminating gun emplacements with satchel charges and grenades. Major General E.J. Milford's men penetrate the first Japanese line within hours, swinging west to the hostile fortress at the hill the Australians refer to as Parramatta Ridge. Although the defenders are tenacious, their redoubt pales by comparison with those on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the 7th Division rolls through before tea time. The campaign proceeds in much the same fashion until 4 July, when the Japanese reassert themselves 6 miles northeast at Mangar Airfield. There, the Australians are pelted by enemy shore batteries and forced to dig in for 5 days of bombardment and counter-bombardment. Finally, with the help of air and naval support, the Imperial guns are silenced and Allied forces once again advance up the shore. Meanwhile, the Japanese mount a final stand on the East Coast Highway. The Australians fight conservatively, minimizing casualties, and allow their superior supply capability to wear down the defenders. In a 12-day siege, the Imperial intruders are reduced to pockets of resistance and eventually forced to withdraw to an ineffective position well north of the oil fields. Driven from Borneo and its oil fields 3 years ago, Allied forces have returned like the proverbial boomerang. On 6 August, the island is declared secure, effectively ending the war in this sector. If Hirohito intends to continue the fight on his home islands, the fuel for his vehicles will have to come from elsewhere. Have organized their stand at the fringe of the island's Kiamu Peninsula, at Konishi Ridge, and in the Aijudake and Yusadake Hills. With the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions to the west and the 7th and 96th Divisions to the east, the Yanks employ what General Simon Buckner earlier called the corkscrew and blowtorch method of warfare. The doomed defenders fight savagely from caves and tunnels, inflicting heavy losses against a hellish onslaught of flamethrowers and artillery from the enemy they now refer to as the Devils. Ushijima's line of defense is stiff and deadly, but much less so than earlier in the campaign, when his fighting units were at full strength. The Japanese, now mostly poorly trained second-line troops, begin losing ground on Kunishi and Yaijudake by 11 June. Disorganized and easily ambushed by Americans attacking at night and from multiple angles, they abandon the hills for good on 17 June. A day later, Buckner watches as a newly arrived detachment of Marines from the 2nd Division takes its place on the southern tip of this island that has seen so much death and destruction. Buckner's observation is cut short by a barrage of 47mm shells from the remaining handful of Japanese artillery pieces. The general is struck in the chest, felling him instantly. Minutes later, Buckner becomes the highest-ranking officer killed in the war. Marine General Roy Geiger steps into Buckner's place as commander of the ground forces on Okinawa and directs the last drive on Ushijima's positions. The 7th Division forges toward the last enemy command post near Mabuni, as inevitable in its approach as the neighborhood bully at 3 o'clock. Still, just beyond the grasp of the Allies, Ushijima makes his final preparations. The end is at hand. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions break through to the southern coast on 20 June, eliminating pockets of resistance by sealing cave entrances with explosives and overwhelming defensive positions with waves of armor. By day's end, all that remains of the Japanese in this sector is a single hill fortification upon which the Marines are free to expend the full fury of their attack. The 7th overruns Mabuni on the same day and lays siege to Hill 89, under which lies Ushijima's final headquarters. Bathed in 5,000 gallons of napalm, the scorched redoubt is soon stripped of resistance. If the Americans are devils, what they create in the waning hours of this conflict certainly passes for hell on earth. But the Japanese commander will not turn himself over willingly. The mouth of the cave leading to the command post is dynamited shut when the dog faces arrive, giving Ushijima a few more hours to himself. For the moment, the GIs must content themselves with processing civilian refugees and rounding up enemy stragglers. The only division not to reach the southern coast is the 96th. They engage a group of holdouts on the Makabe Ridge in the center of the peninsula, pounding the Midget Mountain with heavy armaments and explosives until the ragtag defenders cry "Uncle," as in Uncle Sam. Although much of the naval support fleet has set sail for base in preparation for the anticipated assault on the Japanese home islands, the residual force endures the last gasp kamikaze raids on 21 and 22 June. The 50-odd suicide pilots who evade U.S. radar pickets and fighter patrols inflict only limited damage on American boats during the strike. But the Gobs will be eternally grateful when it is their turn to leave this seaborne shooting gallery. The overall toll levied by the Emperor's air martyrs is a concern to the Navy brass. 38 ships, including 16 destroyers, rest on the ocean floor as a result of kamikaze strikes. Some 300-plus more vessels, from carriers to landing craft, have sustained damage since April Fool's Day. Almost 10,000 casualties bear grim witness to the persistence of the Imperial Air Force. More difficult to count is the number of seamen who will spend their lives awakening in a cold sweat at the sound of an airplane engine in the night. Meanwhile, Geiger orders the Stars and Stripes raised over his headquarters near the Kadena airfield and proclaims the battle won. He is 24 hours early in this assertion, as the 96th Division is still a day away from eliminating the last vestiges of enemy resistance on Makabe Ridge. But there is no doubt that the Americans are firmly in charge here. Geiger gives way to General Joseph Stilwell, whose task is to put this hard-won prize to good use. Already a 95,000-man construction force is busily transforming the island into a staging area for the next stop on the Allied Express, a whirlwind tour of the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. Victory here has come at a high price. U.S. ground forces count 52,000 casualties, half of them from battle fatigue and disease. 75,000 dead Japanese bear witness to the futility of their cause. Another 80,000 Okinawans have fallen victim to a simple case of being at the wrong place in the wrong war. The fight has been a longer, harder one than anyone imagined in those first easy days after the Okinawa landings. But the Allies have arrived in Hirohito's backyard, and they're getting ready to come into the house and stay for a spell. Could help America meet the enemy by doing the jobs they do best: typing, cooking, cleaning. Throughout 1942, women entered the ranks of the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard. In early 1943, even the Marines began recruiting the fairer sex. And air WACs have done everything from controlling air traffic to fueling planes. Between 1942 and 1944, women Air Force service pilots, civilians doing a military job, made a place for women in the sky. They ferried war-bound aircraft from manufacturers to points of embarkation, towed targets for aircraft gunners to home their craft, and performed countless other flying jobs in the States so that male pilots could use their skills in the skies over Germany and Japan. Still, some people don't understand women's vital contributions to the war effort. They even have attacked their character based solely on their military service. To answer their detractors, however, these women would say that they are neither desexed nor oversexed, as they have been variously described. Nor, as the press would sometimes paint them, are they glamour girls. They're just soldiers doing a job and doing it well. Theirs is a duty born of patriotism, as strong as that of any nephew of their Uncle Sam. This is their war, too, and they've proven it repeatedly. With the fighting over in Europe and winding down in the Pacific, the men and women who have secured peace soon will return to civilian life. But as the authors who write this war's history begin their work, will they remember the contributions of military women? They should. When someone asks the inevitable question, what comes of training women for war? They should have ready the answer: victory. They look smart in their uniforms and strike south to meet the 37th. They encounter a few Japanese stragglers and testy caribou along the way, but find little in the way of organized resistance. Hope begins to grow that the Japanese on Luzon have finally called it quits. Meanwhile, Kruger himself prepares to say farewell to the Philippines. On 1st July, his 6th Army is to be relieved by General Robert Eichelberger's 8th. Although mopping up operations will continue against the Shobu group holding out in the northern mountains, the strategic portion of the campaign on Luzon is over. The same might be said for all of the Philippines. Resistance is dead or dying on eastern Mindanao, Bohol, and the Negros. The fighting has long been over in the other southern islands. Air bases are operational, and Filipino citizens are largely free to pick up the threads of their former lives and attempt to piece them back together again. Victory in the Philippines has been costly for everyone, Americans, Filipinos, and Japanese alike. The American and Japanese forces have lost a combined total of almost 400,000 men. While the casualty rate for combatants is not the heaviest in the war, non-battle casualties have been far worse than in other theaters. The hostile climate and unavoidably filthy conditions account for huge losses due to illness and disease. Battle fatigue and shell shock cases have been particularly damaging. Many Pacific Theater troops have seen action in more than one major campaign and have remained in combat for long periods of time. The end to the Pacific War may now be in sight, but weary American troops realize that the invasion of Japan is likely to call on their last reserves of strength, commitment, and courage. Only when Hirohito's empire lies defeated will success in the Philippines acquire its final meaning. Personnel mines became the brutal answer to the problem. Designed to maim rather than kill, their effect on morale is predictable. the perimeter wire around a field. Once laid, stationary mines know no friend, and armies must guard against blundering into their own traps. However, when it becomes clear that ground, once lost, will probably not be recovered, unmarked Despite the continued resistance on Okinawa, it is becoming clear that the last of the Japanese garrison there will eventually succumb, and the island will fall into the hands of the Americans. It is with this thought in mind that the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff begin plotting what will surely be the final and perhaps the most costly operation of the war, the invasion of Japan. It is with a mixture of impatience and reluctance that the Americans begin planning this final battle. With the war in Europe over, there is a strong desire, shared by both the military and the general populace, that the war in the Pacific be brought to an end as quickly as possible. Just the same, U.S. commanders are all too aware that this finale will be neither quick nor easy. Besides the 3 million regular army troops stationed in Japan, all men ages 15 to 60 and all women ages 17 to 45 have been conscripted into a civilian militia numbering some 32 million. The battle for the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and now Okinawa have clearly demonstrated that the closer the Americans get to Japan itself, the more determined and fanatical is the resistance. The U.S. commanders are certain the Japanese stand ready, as would the citizens of any nation, to defend their homeland with their lives if necessary. At this stage of the war, there is little doubt about the outcome. The United States will most certainly defeat Japan. Yet the Joint Chiefs are none too anxious to cast the final die. While doing so is certain to bring this long and bloody conflict to an end, it will just as certainly cost at least 1 million American men their lives. Yet there are those among the U.S. military leaders who are not so sure that the Japanese aren't already beaten. General Douglas MacArthur, who has led the fight in the Pacific from the outset, and who clearly has a much greater understanding of this enemy than any other high-level military official, is among those who believe that an invasion of Japan may be unnecessary. While he is certain that the Japanese warlords will never counsel any strategy but battle to the death, he cautions those in the Pentagon to be alert for signs of conciliation from Japanese statesmen in Tokyo. MacArthur knows that for all intents and purposes, the Japanese are beaten. Their navy has been destroyed, their merchant fleet decimated, their industrial base laid to ruin by constant attack from the air. He and his staff are so certain that Japan is on the brink of collapse that they begin to draw up plans for a peaceful occupation of the country. MacArthur's assessment is right. Despite newspaper headlines and official reports that the war is being won, the Japanese people, starving and struggling to survive without the basic necessities, watching as American bombers fly overhead unmolested and reduce their homes and businesses to rubble, seeing their neighbors dying or fleeing to the countryside, are beginning to question whether or not they are being told the truth. And it is not just the people who are having doubts. The Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union has been making frantic appeals to the Soviet foreign minister, asking that Russia act as a neutral party in developing an armistice with the United States. Those at high levels of government are beginning to suspect that the emperor himself is coming close to admitting defeat. Still, the Americans must assume the worst. All indications have been that the Japanese will fight to the last man and woman, and so they must assume that invasion and conquest are the only way to end the war. And so the planning begins. Okinawa, the last strategic stepping stone necessary for the landing of troops on the shores of the Japanese home islands, will be the jumping-off point for some 750,000 American soldiers, who will embark on an amphibious assault of the southernmost island of Kyushu. Known as Operation Olympic, the attack, which is scheduled for 1st November, will secure strategic airfields and allow troops there to cover the subsequent invasion of the main island of Honshu, scheduled to take place in March of 1946. As they make these plans, as they prepare to send 1 million young men to certain death, there is an abiding hope in the hearts of these generals that they will find a way to avoid a direct assault on the shores of Japan, that Providence will provide them the means once and for all to bring this damnable war to an end without shedding another drop of American blood. Threat posed by a new political star on the rise in Germany, Adolf Hitler. The Germans, seething from humiliations heaped upon them as a result of World War I, were hungry for revenge and arming themselves to the teeth. As England's nervous leaders dabbled in talk of disarmament, Churchill railed against such tomfoolery from the sidelines. He was all but ignored until Hitler moved into the Rhineland in 1936, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. After Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's shilly-shallying efforts at appeasement failed, there was clearly only one man for the job, the cigar-chomping seer of European politics, Winston Churchill. Vowing to achieve victory at all costs, he appointed himself Minister of Defense and energized the war machine at his command. Firing off directives to his staff and preparing for the fight of his life, the Prime Minister took to the field like a booming howitzer compared to Chamberlain's fizzling firecracker. When France fell like a bad souffle and England found itself standing alone on the brink of a German invasion, it was the pugnaciously determined Churchill who squashed talk of a negotiated peace and inspired his countrymen to defy the mighty German Empire. Impudently flashing his signature V for Victory salute, Churchill's brash confidence also inspired America's Lend-Lease program to supply the Allied cause, even before it officially entered the conflict. Churchill was the quintessential wartime leader. Rather than spending all his time in smoke-filled rooms with the policymakers, he believed in being seen. He visited coastal defenses and air bases, inspected the troops at home and in the field, and observed the bombed-out streets of London firsthand. Dispensing his inimitable brand of sympathy and swagger, Churchill became hugely popular with the British people, who dubbed him grandly Good Old Winnie. The English bulldog was hardly infallible, of course. Blotting out the negative side of the ledger is his failed Norwegian campaign and firing on the French fleet in Morocco. Even Churchill's less impressive stratagems, however, did little to tarnish his martial gleam. When Hitler ordered the first airstrikes on London and the Blitz began in earnest, British subjects rallied around the blazing oratory of their dynamic leader.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
Declaring the deadly and terrifying moment of Germany's relentless bombing England's finest hour, Churchill's defiance brought the nation through the initial crisis of threatened invasion and turned Hitler's attention to Russia. Eagerly beating the bushes for allies against the Axis, Churchill swallowed his distaste for communism and agreed to aid Joseph Stalin when Germany invaded in June 1941. He continued to woo his most cherished would-be ally, President Franklin Roosevelt, until Japan played the role of matchmaker by attacking Pearl Harbor. Now that he had the powerful ally that he needed, Churchill began enthusiastically hatching plans to win the war. He believed that the key to beating Germany was by opening fronts on the periphery of the theater, thus stretching the enemy's resources and weakening the center for a knockout blow. North Africa, the Middle East, and Italy all figured in Churchill's strategy and, coincidentally, were all prime areas of British political and economic interest. Stalin's armies had borne the brunt of the war for months, and the Premier pressed for direct relief via an invasion of France. The American generals concurred with this bold thinking, but Churchill argued that Hitler was still too strong to chance a cross-channel assault. Using all his considerable powers of persuasion, the wily Prime Minister flew to Washington, securing Roosevelt's agreement to a campaign in North Africa instead. At the 1943 meeting with Roosevelt in Casablanca, it was play it again, Sam, as Churchill took advantage of Stalin's absence to offer yet another alternative to an attack on French beaches, this time an Allied invasion of Italy. But by the time the three supreme commanders met in Tehran in late 1943, Churchill found that some were becoming more supreme than others. His alternatives to an invasion of Normandy were turned aside, as Roosevelt did a little courting of his own, trying to get Comrade Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan. Long suspicious of Stalin's designs on Eastern Europe, Churchill could only be a sour observer as the Soviets were allowed to keep both the Baltic states and eastern Poland. The long shadow of communism began to fall across the European landscape, but Churchill's political prescience continued to go unheeded. He was skeptical of the plans for Poland agreed upon by the Big Three at Yalta in February of 1945, but by this time he was clearly a junior partner. Still desperate for Soviet aid against Japan, Roosevelt dominated negotiations with Stalin, whose grasping went unchecked. With victory assured and all attention turned to the design of the post-war world, Churchill's greatest contributions to the Allied effort lay behind him. Should he ever disappear forever from the halls of power, his heroics in leading England to stand firm against Hitler and his guidance in helping the Western Allies to victory cement his place in history. An early, quiet exit is unlikely to occur, however. At the venerable age of 70, the bulldog still has plenty of bite left. July 1945, the Pacific. The near demise of the once mighty Imperial Navy allows the American fleet to sail closer to the Japanese home islands than ever before. The ghosts of the massive battleships Yamato and Amagi can do nothing to protect the increasingly vulnerable empire from strikes deep into the heart of Japan's war-making industry. Moving with impunity through the coastal waters off Honshu and Hokkaido, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet prepares to hit, frequently and ferociously, at Japanese industry, shipping, and air bases. The first strike targets Tokyo. Surprisingly, American flyers encounter no aerial opposition and relatively light anti-aircraft fire. The seemingly empty airfields are deceptive, however. The Japanese have carefully dispersed and camouflaged their planes, conserving them for future massed kamikaze attacks. The Americans respond by bombing everything in sight, and with fragmentation devices, plenty that is out of sight. Bad weather delays further action for a few days, but on 14 July, massive air strikes continue on northern Honshu and neighboring Hokkaido Island. In over 1,000 sorties, Yank pilots sink 11 naval vessels, including the destroyer Tachibana and 20 merchant ships. More crippling still to the Japanese war effort, American bombs dispatched the coal-ferrying rail system between the two islands. As the carrier planes wreak havoc from above, a naval bombardment reaches the home islands for the first time in the war. 16-inch guns shelled the ironworks at Kamaishi for 2 hours, setting the plant and the city aflame. On 15 July, Admiral Oscar Badger's task unit continues the barrage on Hokkaido's coast, this time targeting the Nihon Steel Company and the Wanishi Ironworks. This wide-scale destruction of Japan's iron and steel production, as well as the interruption of coal trade between two of the main islands, is disastrous for the empire at this stage of the war. The effect on Japanese morale is a matter for speculation. Tightly controlled propaganda informs the citizens of glorious imperial victories and dismal Allied failures, even when the facts are clearly the opposite. Still believing in ultimate triumph, the people's resolve may only be strengthened by Allied bombing attacks. The truth, when it comes, may be the cruelest blow they suffer. Meanwhile, the relentless bombardment continues. Pilots will be able to hit objectives never before touched from the decks of carriers. And somewhere in the future lies the awe-inspiring prospect of landing an American invasion force on one of the home islands. No one is more welcomed than well-traveled funny man and tireless USO organizer Bob Hope, whose troupe of performers brings humor and humanity to far-flung outposts around the globe and injects a little levity into the grim heart of war. Whether it's the Andrews Sisters' snappy swing or Bing Crosby's signature crooning, songs of home are sure to evoke fond memories for lonely GIs. Perhaps no one needs more morale boosting than wounded GIs who are happy to get the occasional star-studded bedside visit along with their Purple Hearts. To their everlasting credit, celebrities have used their fame and their talent to communicate an important message from everyone at home: that the daily sacrifices of the fighting men are not forgotten. Hollywood screen stars have not limited their contributions to goodwill missions and entertainment, however. One of the first to enlist was matinee icon Jimmy Stewart, who served in the 8th Air Force. Colonel Stewart never had a bomb at the box office, but he has dropped more than a few flying missions over Germany. Screen idol Clark Gable, known to millions as the dashing Rhett Butler, enlisted after the tragic death of his movie star wife, Carol Lombard. At the age of 40, Gable insisted on being close to the action and was assigned to heavy bomber crews as a combat photographer. Being a famous American in the skies over Germany carries additional perks. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering has offered a $5,000 bounty to the pilot who brings down the mustachioed actor, but frankly, Gable doesn't give a damn. With its inimitable mix of style and substance, grit and glitz, Hollywood has kept its pledge to support the war effort. The film community has played its part well, and for many thankful soldiers returning from abroad, future sacrifice and danger, intrigue and suspense will be experienced only in the cozy confines of their favorite movie house, not on the treacherous ground of a foreign field. Enormously expensive, but it has also been enormously successful. The scientists and engineers working around the clock have succeeded in accomplishing all the tasks they were assigned. The atom bomb, the most powerful weapon ever created, is now a reality. By throwing a switch, man can now convert small amounts of matter into large amounts of energy. In theory. Before this weapon can be used against the enemy, it must be tested. While all of the equations on all of the blackboards at the Los Alamos laboratory indicate that it will work, it is all still so much conjecture, and no one can be absolutely certain that the atom bomb will not turn out to be the atom dud. And so Oppenheimer, military personnel and scientists, and a few trusted members of the press have gathered here in the New Mexico desert to witness what they hope will be the first atomic explosion in history. The group assembles at a command dugout 10 miles from Trinity, the name given to the actual test site. There, mounted on a 100-foot steel tower, hangs a mass of switches, wires, and explosive devices surrounding 5 kilograms of plutonium. This is Ground Zero. As the countdown approaches its end and the men huddle in bunkers or lie prone, waiting for the explosion, there is a sense that they are about to witness more than a weapons test. This bomb 17 July 1945 occupied Germany after utter defeat in its quest for European domination. The fatherland's future is now being decided by its enemies. Allied leaders meeting in Berlin in what is being called the Potsdam Conference are ironing out numerous points of contention between the Soviets and the Western Alliance. The only thing everyone seems capable of agreeing on is that the German people must acknowledge that they have suffered complete military defeat, and that never again will their armies be allowed to march across Europe. To that end, Germany will be divided into 4 zones of influence. Russia will control the east, Britain the northwest, France the southeast, and the United States the south. Germany's military capacity will be completely denuded. Beyond the mere disbandment of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, all clubs or organizations keeping alive German military tradition are outlawed. German industry, whose tanks, planes, and guns fueled the Blitzkrieg, is to be placed under Allied control. Industrial capacity not readily converted to civilian applications will be destroyed. To prevent future German aggression, the entire German educational system will be restructured, eliminating militaristic and Nazi doctrine. The judicial system is to be recast under the principles of democracy, giving equal protection under the law regardless of race, religion, or nationality. On 26 July, with the conference underway, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill returns to England for the general election. To the surprise of Churchill and the world, Churchill's Conservatives go down to defeat. The Socialists win by an amazing 2-to-1 landslide. The new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, returns to Berlin to represent England. While President Truman is helping to sculpt post-war Germany, the war with Japan bears heavily on his mind. On 16 July, he receives word of the successful testing of an atomic bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico. This bit of news relieves him of the pressure of getting a commitment out of Stalin to join the Pacific War. He is now certain that American troops landing on the shores of Japan will do so only when the surrender is complete, as an occupation force. Truman also believes this new bomb strengthens his position in trying to control Soviet aspirations. On 24 July, he offhandedly mentions to Stalin that the United States has a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, whose spies already have reported to him about activities at Alamogordo, outwardly shows no special interest, saying only that he is glad and hopes the U.S. will make good use of the weapon against the Japanese. On 26 July, waiting to give the Japanese an opportunity to surrender, the United States, England, and China issue an ultimatum, calling for the immediate and unconditional surrender of all Japanese forces. The statement assures the Japanese their only alternative is complete and utter destruction. Japan's military leaders, as fanatically determined as ever, refuse the demand. As the conference draws to a close, Germany's fate is sealed. The entire social, political, and economic life of the country lies, at least for the near future, beyond the control of its citizens. While the new system is most certainly more conducive to a peaceful coexistence with the rest of Europe, there is a sense of foreboding in the mistrust and ill will between the Soviets and the West. Only history will tell if the remaking of Germany will lead to a viable, democratic nation-state, or if it will become the focus of contention between East and West, a fissure in the heart of Europe. prime minister and derided Labour's socialist ideas and inexperience in government. Results from the 5 July balloting were delayed for 3 weeks while the votes of service people abroad were collected. Savvy political prognosticators in Britain predicted that Churchill's re-election was not a foregone conclusion, despite his popularity. One significant unknown in the mix was the large number of first-time voters who 10 years ago were more worried about puberty than public weal. The older electorate had lived through the results of the Great War: depression, unemployment, working-class poverty, and appeasement. Whatever the factors, Labour won its first overall majority in history on a platform of social reforms. More than the status quo, it seems, the public wants new and better housing, universal health care, jobs for returning soldiers, and a long-lasting peace. In the midst of the Potsdam Conference, Prime Minister-elect Attlee will travel to Germany with new Foreign Secretary Bevan to continue negotiations for peace. Without Churchill, how different the look is now at the bargaining tables of power. Who could have imagined that the future of the world would be shaped by a triumvirate of Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Clement Attlee? Throughout their island-hopping campaign, one of the greatest obstacles facing the With their construction tasks completed, the Seabees willingly pitched in wherever needed. On Okinawa, when rough terrain hampered efforts to supply forward units with much-needed ammunition, the Seabees carried the ammo on their backs. Many were killed and wounded, but the ammo got forward unabated. All the men and women who contributed to the defeat of the Nazis in Europe and who are contributing to the defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific are heroes. The farmers in the field, the riveters on the line, and the kids rounding up scrap metal for the smelters have all sacrificed for the common good, giving of themselves above and beyond the call of duty. But in battle, there is a different sort of heroism, because in battle there is not just personal inconvenience to overcome, but also the possibility of death and dismemberment, of total sacrifice. To become a hero in battle, it is necessary to put the communal cause ahead of the individual's most basic instinct, survival. As the war ends, hundreds of thousands of Americans are returning home as decorated veterans, the ribbons on their chests barely hinting at their accomplishments. They are, almost literally, the kids next door, torn from peacetime normalcy to fight a war not of their own making. Almost to a man, they have risen to the occasion, fighting not for the glory, but for the good, asking little in return but the chance, eventually, to return home and resume their previous lives. As time passes, their tales will be told. Grandchildren at fireside will hear how they charged into enemy fire, fought without rest for weeks or even months at a stretch, and reached out with a hand of kindness to a continent in ruins. In a war this vast, extraordinary heroism becomes almost a common thing. But among those many veterans, there will be a few, a bare handful, really, who return wearing the nation's highest commendation, the Congressional Medal of Honor. The recipients of that award are anything but common. Men whose bravery and selflessness in battle are so great that they demand to be recognized not just by units or branches or states, but by the nation as a whole. In 1862, Congress authorized the casting of a medal to be given to non-commissioned officers and privates as shall most distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action during the present insurrection. A year later, officers were made eligible for the decoration, which is awarded based on 8 criteria: setting a personal example under fire that inspires other men, devotion to duty under fire, accepting danger, saving life, overcoming one's injuries, defeating great odds, taking command, and seizing the opportunity to strike a blow at the enemy. Vice President. Word of the weapons, more will die of radiation sickness. boxcar, mission complete, is forced to land at Okinawa, MacArthur's most recent acquisition, a safe landing site won with American blood only 2 weeks earlier. Truman again demands the Japanese surrender. Whether the arrogant militarists who hold the reins of command in Japan will listen, Truman doesn't know. What he does know, however, is whatever they do, he has no more atom bombs. But Japan's fanatic generals, of course, were firmly against it. They said Japan could repulse any American invasion. Japanese army units could be concentrated at the American landing sites. Japanese Air Force planes in waves of kamikaze assaults could strafe the American transports and their troops. And if the American troops moved further inland, they'd encounter volunteer reserve forces who'd fight them. This ludicrous assessment of Japan's ability to stave off a stronger, better-equipped American invasion reflects how obsessed the generals are with military honor. They talk about a general decisive battle that adheres to a vigorous spirit of attack to set the example for 100 million compatriots. So, perhaps against the wiser judgment of the political leaders, Japan listed the following conditions for peace: no military occupation of Japan, the right to try their war criminals themselves, and the right to disarm their own troops rather than surrender directly to the Allies. The final point is a face-saving offer from the generals. Maybe the Japanese public will think that Japanese forces hadn't been defeated, but had merely laid down their arms voluntarily. U.S. Secretary of State James Burns firmly rejects those conditions, saying only unconditional surrender was acceptable. Burns added that this meant the Emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. That is too much for the Japanese in early summer. They fear the Emperor being deposed and the elimination of Japan's chrysanthemum throne. The Japanese generals know their soldiers will never surrender if it means the loss of their Emperor. So they fight on. But now, in August, their old friends the Soviets have declared war on Japan. Old Stalin has his eye on gaining the southern half of Sakhalin Island as well as the Kuril Islands and the old Russian bases of Port Arthur and Dairen in South Manchuria. So 80 Soviet divisions race across the Gobi Desert and over mountainous terrain to push the Japanese out of China. The Soviets are far superior in men, equipment, and experience to the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria, which has only 24 poorly equipped divisions to face them. Many of the Kwantung soldiers are aging or unfit. They have almost no fighting experience. Their equipment is obsolete. The first-rate Japanese troops and equipment headed to the Pacific Front long ago. The Kwantung soldiers are, by and large, overrun by the Soviets, with thousands of Japanese captured as prisoners. Only occasionally does a Japanese unit offer up resistance. The mounting losses in China are then joined by the devastation of the 2 atomic bombs. Back in Tokyo, the Emperor calls his Supreme Council for the direction of the war back to his bomb-proof bunker. The council members argue over what the Americans' term of unconditional surrender, subject to, might mean for the Emperor. It falls to the Emperor himself to make a decision, and Hirohito calls for the immediate acceptance of the Allied demand. He tells his stunned and saddened council that it should bow to my wishes and accept. The next day, on 15 August, Hirohito's high voice of the crane goes out to his 100 million loyal subjects for the first time in their lives via a noon radio broadcast. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the war situation developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. The Emperor told his subjects that he was aware of their innermost feelings about surrendering, and aware it would subject them to new and great hardship and suffering. However, says Hirohito, we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Several army leaders commit suicide rather than hear the Emperor agree to surrender, and assassins make attempts on some of the political leaders. But most Japanese accept the will of their Emperor. It is the only real choice they have. Could play a significant role in war. A successful launch of an experimental A-4 rocket in 1942 convinced Der Fuhrer otherwise. Rocket research became the highest Nazi priority. More than 2,000 scientists worked developing rockets at Peenemünde, Germany's main missile research facility on the Baltic Sea. The result of this massive effort was the V2, a 46-foot liquid fuel rocket that carried a ton of high explosives at speeds exceeding 3,000 miles an hour. It was, without a question, the greatest technological achievement of the war. Though lacking a guidance system that would make the V2 an accurate weapon aimed at London and later Antwerp, the V2 was stunningly effective. The Nazis fired more than 1,000 V2s at London, killing almost 3,000 civilians and injuring thousands more. And even as the Allies endured that onslaught, they also saw in it rocketry's almost unlimited military possibilities. After the invasion of Normandy, the American High Command sought to capture German missile launchers, not just to prevent further attacks on Allied cities, but also to secure hardware that could be shipped home for further study. Even before the end of the war, Americans working at White Sands under Robert Goddard dissected, reassembled, line workers. The enormous surplus of men and equipment created by victory in Europe is beginning to have its effects back home. Factories previously dedicated to the production of tanks are now retooling to manufacture automobiles. Instead of bombers, passenger planes are rolling off assembly lines. While some women happily return to a life of domesticity, many, after doing their part to win the war, have found fulfillment in their new role outside the home. Men, lucky enough to be on the first ships returning home, find themselves competing for jobs with women who, when they left for the war, were relegated to the kitchen. The same can be said for African Americans. The indisputable record of black units in this war stands as proof of the ability, patriotism, and intelligence of the black airmen, soldiers, and sailors. The sacrifices these men have made, the dedication they have shown, demand an equal measure of gratitude and respect. Upon returning home, the black man in America will likely no longer settle for second-class citizenship. As in 1941, Americans again face a future of vast uncertainty. Their problems are real, and there are no easy answers. But if they maintain the spirit and determination exhibited over the past 5 years, Americans may hold in their hands the key to a glorious and seemingly boundless future. August 1945, Tokyo. The world awaits E-Day. It's less a question of if Union agreed on the aims, structure, and function of a world organization. At Yalta earlier this year, Stalin, Churchill, and the then ailing Roosevelt reiterated their resolve to establish, among the Allies, a general international organization to maintain peace and security. Nonetheless, a cloud of controversy hangs over the conference. Fueled by mutual mistrust between the Soviets and their Western allies, the British and the Americans, the delegates struggled to resolve some difficult issues. One is a Soviet demand for extra votes in the new organization's General Assembly. The Soviets fear this new organization will be used against them and want to avoid being outvoted. Other countries argue against giving the Russian bear any extra clout. They complain about the Moscow-backed government running Poland, and some of the Latin American countries grumble about the Soviets blocking Argentina from membership. Argentina, however, has a bit of a public relations problem. Its regime traded with Nazi Germany throughout the war. Another contentious issue shadowing the San Francisco conference is the new organization's Security Council. It is composed of 5 permanent members: the Soviets, the British, the Americans, the Chinese, and now the French, plus 6 rotating delegates from other countries. The Security Council is to have the authority to use any means necessary, including military force, to maintain international peace and security. But the proposal also gives the 5 permanent members veto power over any Security Council action, and no one can agree on how that veto power will be used. Meanwhile, haunted by the failure of the League of Nations, the U.S. Department of State has invited representatives of 42 civic organizations ranging from the Kiwanis and the American Bar Association to the Grange and the NAACP to attend. The hope is that their participation will foster a groundswell of political support for the fledgling UN. The State Department wants to avoid a repeat of its experience with the League of Nations, particularly the U.S. Senate's refusal to support the League and endorse its covenant. League of Nations officials are at this conference, but they are relegated to the background. They have back row seats and second-rate hotels, and their input is limited mostly to informal comments. The representatives of these 42 civic organizations, acting as citizen consultants, receive far more attention. They use it to create a new initiative to add to the UN Charter provisions for respecting human rights. The philosophy is that world peace and security also flow from respecting basic human rights, equal rights, and the right of a people to self-determination. It opens the way for individuals and groups to challenge their government for social, economic, and political justice, and to have the world's support in those challenges. Some of America's allies are less than thrilled with this new initiative. The Soviets naturally are disinclined to favor these proposals, since their government emphasizes the collective good over individual rights. The new organization's Economic and Social Council to a level equal with the Security Council and the General Assembly. They also changed the wording of the preamble, eliminating phrases such as the high contracting parties to something closely resembling the wording in the U.S. Constitution. The charter now reads, "We the peoples of the United Nations," and it goes on to promise that the new organization will reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, promote equal rights among men and women, and foster social progress and better standards of life. Above all, the new United Nations promises to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Hirohito's humiliated minions climb aboard the battleship Missouri for the final indignity of World War II. General Yoshijiro Umetsu and Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu have been tapped to sign the Articles of Surrender, thus signaling the beginning of the Allied occupation of Japan. Shigemitsu is in many ways as the dissemination of a great truth, the nobility of the Allied cause, and the sureness of its victory. Perhaps less visionary was the American War Department, which assigned the vast majority of photographers to prosaic tasks like battle damage assessment, microfilming mail, and making training films. But those photographers assigned to actual combat took it upon themselves to look at the war from a wider angle, in the process convincing a hesitant bureaucracy that history was as worthy a client as the war effort. Though the newsreel companies dispatched their own private crews to document many of the news events surrounding the war, the vast majority of combat footage was gathered by photographers collecting only military pay. Assigned in teams of 3, still photographer, motion picture photographer, and driver, the combat photographers fanned out over the war. Their credentials granted them access and mobility unprecedented in wartime. They worked under the most dire conditions, in many cases right on the front lines, forced by their craft to ignore the natural urge to flee from danger. They carried rifles along with their cameras, fighting and sometimes dying in their quest. They rendezvoused daily with couriers, shipping the exposed film off without much chance of ever seeing their own work, feeling at times as if they were risking their lives for nothing. They could not have been more wrong. As the war progressed, the public hunger for information required that images shuttle around the world with previously unheard-of speed. A photograph taken during an assault on Sicily might appear on the front page of a New York newspaper in 48 hours, carried by a combination of airplane and radio waves across a continent and an ocean. Movie houses converted to 24-hour all-newsreel formats. Film freshly arrived from the front went into the projector without preview, and the latest imagery from Normandy and the Philippines was the hottest ticket in town. War documentaries were nominated for and won Academy Awards and became the dominant means by which the public came to know the experience of the war. Now that the participants are getting on with their lives, the memory of the war will fade and eventually blow away. But living forever, bringing the reality of the Second World War to the generations to come, will be the work of the largely anonymous combat cameraman. But bitter ethnic ranches, Warsaw, Berlin, and Budapest, were smashed by bombs and must be completely rebuilt. In the fire-bombed cities of Dresden and Hamburg, Crumbled buildings and unrecovered bodies form the tragic understory of the new cities that will be built on top of the old. Japan, with its fragile paper-walled homes, was especially scale is overwhelming. The rest of the hungry and destitute world now seems to depend on the economic might of the United States, as it is industrially more productive than every other nation combined. No matter how many relief planes and food boats arrive from America, however, there is not enough to go around. Long ration lines fighting in the streets and the despair etched into the faces of the young are familiar scenes to occupying forces and aid workers. The dispossessed and hungry look to the United States for relief and guidance in the dark days ahead. As the Iron Curtain slams down on much of Eastern Europe and communism begins to seep into Asia, American democracy strives to shed its beacon light on countries struggling for self-determination and the preservation of its people. The monumental expense of blood and spirit that achieved victory and suffered ignominious defeat provides a dark inheritance for generations to come. In the midst of uncertainty and loss, there is only one hope, one light, one guide for the road that lies ahead. The promise of peace. World War II, the most horrific conflict in history, has touched lives all over the globe. Millions have coped with death, famine, and destruction as part of their daily existence. And while everyone's first priority is to return to a peaceful life, there is a consensus that those who led the world into the turmoil of war and those who used that war as an excuse to commit heinous criminal acts must be held accountable. To that end, the Allies have indicted those men in both Germany and Japan whose unquenchable thirst for power and twisted vision of racial superiority led to the utter devastation of Europe and Asia. In Germany, the German High Command, the SS and SA, the Nazi Party leadership, the Gestapo, and the Reich Cabinet are all indicted, as are 21 individuals whose pivotal roles in Germany's quest for European domination is undeniable. Chief among these is Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Göring. Goering's influence within the Nazi Party and the German military was unrivaled. From the Nazis' early days in Munich beer halls to their brutal subjugation of nearly all Europe, Goering did whatever was convenient or advantageous at the time without regard for human life. Among the others indicted are General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the German High Command, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Chief of the German Navy, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi Foreign Minister. All the defendants faced the same 4 charges: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence accumulated by the prosecutors is impressive in both quantity and scope. Much of it is from the Nazis' own files, captured by the Allies in the closing days of the war. Documents, photographs, and motion pictures all tell the story of a ruthless, sadistic regime bent on the conquest of Europe and the extermination of its Jews. Goering recoils upon seeing the motion pictures of the concentration camps. He admits the camps were initially his idea, but only to re-educate political prisoners. He claims Himmler was in charge of the camps since 1934 and that he, Hitler's most trusted aide, had no idea such terrible things took place. Day after day, the tribunal, made up of representatives of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, perused the massive amount of evidence. The Germans uniformly disavow any knowledge of the atrocities and claim that in waging their aggressive war, they were only following orders. The world is left unconvinced, and after almost 11 months of testimony, on the afternoon of 1st October 1946, the tribunal announces its verdicts. 3 defendants are acquitted. 4 are sentenced to various terms of imprisonment, and 11, including Goering, Ribbentrop, and Keitel, are sentenced to death by hanging. In Japan, preparations are also underway to seek justice against those responsible for Japan's transgressions. On 19 November 1945, General Douglas MacArthur orders the arrest of 11 Japanese war leaders. Chief among them is General Hideki Tojo. As the principal proponent of Japanese expansionist policy, Tojo was responsible for Japan's ruthless drive across China and the Pacific. After a failed suicide attempt, Tojo is taken into custody and placed in prison to await his trial. Unlike his Nazi counterparts, Tojo readily accepts responsibility for Japan's wartime activities. Also taken into custody in Manila is General Yamashita, the Tiger of the Philippines. Under his supervision, Japanese troops brutally raped, murdered, and tortured Filipino civilians, burning their villages as they went. He was also responsible for the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war during the infamous Bataan Death March. Yamashita, like the German general, argues that he was only acting under orders from his superiors. So as the Nuremberg trials conclude and the trials in Japan are ready to begin, the Allies have taken an important step forward in reaping a measure of justice for a war-torn world. An example has been set for all people to see, that those responsible for aggressive war will be held responsible, and that there are lines which cannot be crossed, acts of barbarism which will not be tolerated, even in wartime. Peace. With the cessation of hostilities in Europe and the Pacific, the hopes and prayers of millions of people the world over have been answered. And for the first time in years, there is cause for celebration. The future, for so long uncertain, now shines with possibilities for a new and better world. Having been absent for what seems like an eternity, hope once again returns to the hearts of those who have survived mankind's darkest hour. It is human nature to try and cull good from even the most dreadful circumstances, to seek solace in the idea that their toil and anguish have not been meaningless. So it is with World War II. Any event that demands such tremendous sacrifice that irrevocably alters the lives of individuals and mankind as a whole, by its nature, demands the question, why? What possible? It is perhaps the ultimate. It is unfortunate but true that war is indiscriminate, and in World War II the lines of sacrifice were obliterated, with civilians suffering and dying in greater numbers than those in uniform. Tipping the scale in this tragic equation, no doubt, was the virulent hatred that fueled the actions of the aggressors, including acts of carnage against the innocent so repugnant that man's concepts of cruelty and inhumanity shall forever be altered. Those left alive, many too young to understand the whys and wherefores of the nightmare they have endured, will bear scars both physical and emotional for the rest of their lives. Peace. The final shot has been fired, and the final rifle laid down, and the vanquished has delivered unto the victor that which is his. Those who lived through it can never be as they were. Too much has been given away, both in body and spirit. Those who follow will be unable to escape its touch, if for no other reason than that our understanding of human conduct, both righteous and malevolent, has been irrevocably changed. And what of the questions raised by the war? It is perhaps better left to historians to argue the fine points. For the moment, all that is certain is that there was an armed conflict that engulfed the world. that 50 million people lost their lives in the course of that struggle, and that, at its end, the world was a safer and better place than when it began. As the people of the world heave a collective sigh and turn their backs on World War II, as they prepare to rebuild their homes and lives, there is a sense that they stand at a portal in history, perched on the dividing line between one age of mankind and another. And with that sense comes an exhilaration, a rush of excitement at being alive, a singular human experience. For those who step out of the darkness to stand squinting into the sunrise, it seems certain that, despite all that has passed before and all that is sure to follow, there has never been a moment in time such as there was as the world